Hello again. Today we are changing out the water pump on a 2006 Range Rover Sport. The water pump may need to be changed if it fails, which may be seen with overheating and no turbulence seen in the coolant reservoir. Or as in my case, the coolant pump gasket has failed and has caused a coolant leak. For coolant leaks, you will eventually note a low coolant warning in the instrument cluster. It's not uncommon for this warning to pop up even though the coolant level is actually normal, but it's really just due to a faulty sensor in the coolant reservoir. Check the coolant reservoir to see if it's actually low, and if it is, then you may have a leak. Consider using a black light to help find the leak, since coolants contain fluorescent if they're yellow or green, or some other fluorescent dyes. In my case, the leak appears to be around the coolant pump, which is a common site for leaks due to gasket failure. For this job, you'll need a 8mm and a 10mm socket. I'm using a 1/4 inch ratchet. You will need some extensions, a 1/2 inch and a 3/8 inch breaker bar to remove the belts. I'm just going to use a 1/2 inch to 3/8 converter for this. Some pliers to remove the coolant hoses, a soft metal brush, a 36mm radiator fan wrench along with its bolt holder to remove the radiator fan, the new coolant pump and its gasket, the one seen here is the old one, a funnel, and I strongly recommend a fluid pump to drain the coolant without having to mess around under the car. You'll also need about 2 gallons of coolant. I'm also going to use gloves to keep my hands relatively clean. Now let's get started. The first thing you're going to need to do is to remove the radiator fan cover. To do this, you need to just unclip the hose at 2 spots and then disconnect the fan. Once that's complete, you can just snap it off. There's just snaps on both sides holding it in. When you remove it, just be a little bit careful not to pull on the hose too hard. One thing that's a good idea is to get a fluid catcher and just put it under the front part of the car. Fluid's going to be leaking here and there all during the procedure, so it's just a good idea to have a catch pan. Now to drain the coolant, you can either get under the car and disconnect the radiator from the radiator hose right here. However, there's not a lot of room under there, and you have to actually take off a shroud that is in the wheel well so that you can access the hose. An easier way to go about this is to just disconnect the radiator hose portion that you see under the hood here. And then you take your fluid transfer pump and you just suck out the coolant all the way down to the bottom of the hose. The bottom of the hose is basically plugged right into the radiator, so doing this is essentially the same as if you disconnected the radiator hose from the bottom. However, doing it this way is 1,000 times easier. So you just plug in the input side to the bottom of the hose as far as you can, and then you put the output into a empty coolant container. And this way you can kind of tell how much coolant you've taken out also. And it'll give you a little relative idea about how much you need to put in. Once you're done, you can just remove the hose and continue with the procedure. It looks like I have about a full bottle of coolant, so it's about 1 gallon. The next step is to remove the radiator fan, and so you'll need your 36mm fan clutch wrench. The nut is right hand turn, so you have to turn it to the right instead of the left. Of course, you're going to slam your hands together. This happens pretty much every single time you do this. Because you have opposing forces and you're just directing your hands right at each other. So wear gloves to blunt the force a little bit, otherwise you might get cut by the metal. Once the fan comes all the way off, you can just put it aside for now. You'll notice the belt is already off because this is me from the future. So what you want to do is put some cardboard over the radiator fins so you don't accidentally dent them when you're moving your tools in and out or just pulling parts off. The part that you really need to do, because I skipped this part, is to take the belt off. And to do this you just need a 1/2 inch breaker bar. And put a little bit of torque on there and you should be able to slip the belt off. You really only need to take off the top portion. Now you're definitely going to need your bolt holder for removing the bolts on the pulleys. This is just to keep them from spinning, really. The bolt holder probably should go on the left. This is just to show you how it goes. Once you crack them free, you should be able to undo them by hand. And these are 10mm bolts. But once you have them all free, you should be able to wiggle the pulley off. If you get stuck, you can hit it with a mallet or something along those lines. The next step is to remove this radiator hose bracket. It's a 8mm bolt, but it covers one of the top bolts on the pulley bracket that will need to be removed later. So just remove the bracket, and now you have access to the 5 bolts that hold the pulley bracket in place. The pulley bracket is also all 8mm bolts, so just take your time and use extensions and get all 5 of those bolts out. And once they're all out, then you can finally remove the pulley bracket. The bolts are actually pretty long, and so you'll need to use these little cutouts in the pulley bracket to fully extract the bolts. Once they're all out, now the bracket is finally free and you can pull it out and take a look at it. But ultimately you're just putting it aside to get it out of the way. Next we want to take the accessory drive belt off, and this is a 3/8 inch breaker bar. But instead of using a specific breaker bar, you can just put an adapter on your 1/2 inch. So put some torque to the left to loosen the accessory belt, and again you just need to take the belt off of the top pulley. You might need to finagle it a little bit and get it unstuck. There's a couple of things that it might want to get stuck on. Ultimately, try to remember how the pulley goes, because it wraps around certain components in a certain way. In order to get a little bit more working space, I'm going to disconnect this radiator hose here, and that will drop this long hose down, and it'll clear the way so I can see the pulley bolts a little bit easier. So I'll just wiggle it off, and then it drops down pretty far. There's actually quite a bit of coolant coming out of this hose. I was a little bit surprised, so I decided to suck some of that out too. And it make sure you're putting it in the right way, of course, because if you put the transfer pump in the opposite way, you're just going to blow a bunch of air out. And so I fixed it here, and then I just sucked some of the coolant out. Once you remove as much coolant as you can, now you can start to undo the 3 bolts that are on the water pump pulley. And again, you're going to need to use the bolt holder for these bolts, since it is a pulley, and so if you tried to turn them counterclockwise, it's just going to spin the pulley. Now I got a little bit unlucky with the pulley and that it got stuck, so I need to hammer it a little bit. It actually didn't take much, and then you can wiggle it out the rest of the way. And that's it. Now you can finally get to the coolant pump, and it's just a matter of removing the bolts. My guess is that the bottom portion of the gasket has failed and the coolant is leaking out here, but it's hard to say because the coolant will be on the bottom regardless of where it's leaking. But that being said, just make sure to take a look at the new pump and realize where the bolts are. 2 of these bolts are going to stay, this one and this one. And so there's no point in removing those because those hold the pump together. And so remove all the other bolts. This will again be the 8mm socket for these 5 bolts. But once they're all removed, then you'll get a little bit of coolant leakage again. And you can take a look at the gasket from the old pump. Looks a little bit worn, but I'm not seeing anything crazy. There's a little bit of buildup, but where the new gasket is going to go. So what I would recommend is just taking your soft metal brush and brushing the mating surface a little bit. This will get some of the residue and gunk out of the way and hopefully allow the new gasket to last a little bit longer. So take the new pump and its new gasket, make sure everything is where it's supposed to be, and put it back into place. Once it's all bolted back on, you can take the pulley again, but before you put it on, make sure the holes are aligned upwards. This because what you're doing is you're putting the pulley on blind. You can't really see where the holes are lining up, and so as long as they're both upwards, you'll have a pretty good chance of having them line up, and then you can test it out by trying to put a bolt in. I got lucky here and the holes are lining up first try, but that's not always the case. Once you have all the bolts in place, it's time to reconnect the radiator hose that was disconnected earlier. So just slip the hose back on and move the hose clamp back up into position, and that should do it. Next, we're going to need to reposition the belt, and while I did only slip it off the top belt, the remaining parts of the belt have kind of worked their way loose also, and so you really need to make sure that all of the accessories that are on the accessory drive are where they're supposed to be before you let go of the tensioner. You might need to refer to the diagram that was previously put up to make sure everything is where it's supposed to be. Be warned, however, the diagram has a dynamic response pump. However, this vehicle and a lot of non-supercharged vehicles don't have that, and so that pump in the top left will be missing. Once the accessory drive belt is back on, it's just time to reconnect the pulley bracket for the fan. And the pulley bracket needs to be fixed in place before the radiator hose bracket goes into place, not the other way around. You can see here that I'm fastening the radiator hose bracket. For the fan pulley, it's the same story as for the water pump pulley. You have to align the holes up, or in some direction that you can remember, and then also align the holes up on the pulley itself. And doing this hopefully will line up the holes, and then you can put in a bolt. Once all the bolts are fastened, now it's time to reconnect this belt. And again, take your 1/2 inch breaker and just loosen the tensioner and put the belt back on. Finally, go grab your radiator fan wherever you put it and twist it back on. This time it turns to the left to tighten. And so tighten it as much as you want to. It's a self-tightening nut. And reconnect it to the wiring harness. Alright, and once that's back in place, now you can replace your radiator shroud. And so just get the... Just kidding. What you really need to do is remove your cardboard shield out of the way. So I actually forgot to do this. It just was out of sight, out of mind, and I ran the car for a couple minutes with it in place. Luckily I remembered and removed it later. But yeah, once that's removed, you can reconnect the radiator fan shroud, and it's just reconnecting the harness in different spots and snapping it back into place. Don't forget to refill the system with coolant, and what I did was I flushed some of the old coolant out of the pump with the new coolant so that it's not full of old coolant. And once I did that, then you can take it over to the car and fill up the reservoir as much as you can, along with the radiator hose as much as you can. And this is all in an attempt just to prevent massive amounts of air being in the system. Once you're done here, you can reconnect the large radiator hose to the thermostat and reposition its hose clamp. Now the bleeding instructions for this vehicle are to leave the bleeder screws closed and fill the reservoir up with coolant. Once you do this, leave the cap off and start the vehicle and let it warm up. What you're really looking for is that the hose coming off of the thermostat gets warm. When this hose gets warm or hot, that's when you know the thermostat's open and coolant is now circulating into the radiator as opposed to just staying in the engine. Once that happens, then you can turn the car off, and you will probably notice all of the coolant gets sucked out of the reservoir, and at that point you can fill it back up and put the cap on. I would check the coolant level over the next few days and top it up as necessary. And that's it. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. I make Range Rover Sport and LR3 repair videos as issues pop up on my own car, so don't forget to subscribe if you don't want to miss any simple fixes that could hopefully save you thousands over taking it to a dealer. Thank you and have a good one.